Thank you so very much for joining us today. Hello and welcome. My name is Jerry Dietrich, Public Participation Specialist for the Department of Toxic Substances Control, or Dtsc. Today's Web and Learn is on the Year 1 site for the Dtsc Discovery and Enforcement Program. Our presenter today is Rafat Abbasi, Chief of the Discovery and Enforcement Program. Thank you again for joining us and spending this time with us today. Slide 2, please. Simultaneous interpretation in Spanish is available for this webinar. To access the interpretation tool, look for your Zoom toolbar on the bottom of your screen and click on the icon that looks like the globe. Once you click the icon, the language option will show and you can select your preferred language. If you're using your smartphone, look for the More icon with the 3 little dots on your phone and then select it. And the options for languages will appear so you can choose your language preference. There are some graphics on this slide. Moving to slide 3. Presentation materials will be posted to the Discovery and Enforcement webpage after the webinar, but for right now, we're posting the link in the chat for immediate viewing. The Discovery and Enforcement webpage is www.dtsc.co.discovery-and-enforcement. We will be using the chat to provide all of you with information as we move through the slides. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the Q&A box located on your Zoom toolbar. In addition to the Zoom interpretation feature, you can also receive Spanish interpretation by phone by calling 1-877-920-8432. Enter code 741-502, followed by the pound sign. All this information is also in the chat for you. Closed captions have been enabled. You can turn them off or on by clicking the live transcription or CC icon at the bottom of your toolbar. Slide 4, please. During today's Web and Learn, we ask everyone to follow the meeting agreements by being courteous and concise so we can make the most of the time that we have. Please speak clearly and evenly to ensure all meeting participants receive the same information. You can use the Q&A box to type in your question or comments throughout the event. If you haven't done so already, please click your language interpretation icon and choose a language. By participating in this meeting, you do understand that this meeting is being recorded for future viewing, and you may be muted to avoid background noise on the recording. Slide 5, please. The Discovery and Enforcement Program is part of DTSC's Cleanup in Vulnerable Communities Initiative, or CVCI. During the first presentation, we'll provide a brief background on CVCI and present the Discovery and Enforcement site selection process of the 112 sites identified for Year 1. We will also introduce the Petition Application Process and explain to you how you can use it to suggest sites to the program. Lastly, we will provide a quick update on the Orphan Sites. The rest of the time will be used for Q&A before we close. Slide 6, please. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Rafat Abbasi, Dtsc Chief of the Discovery and Enforcement Program. Welcome, Rafat. It's all yours.
Thank you, Jerry. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to attend this. My name is Rafat Abbasi. As Jerry mentioned, I'm Chief of the Discovery and Enforcement Program. I will be providing an overview of our Discovery and Enforcement Program, which is part of the Cleanup in Vulnerable Communities Initiative. Next slide, please. Just a little bit to start off, a little bit about a Cleanup in Vulnerable Communities Initiative, which Discovery Enforcement is part of. The initiative, the governor's vision for the initiative was to really address environmental conditions in vulnerable communities and see that the department has the necessary funding to investigate these sites and clean up these sites as appropriate. And at some point down the road, once these sites are cleaned up, we can have a proper use of these sites and revitalize those communities that are vulnerable. So that's really how the vision of the Cleanup and Vulnerable Communities Initiative was. It's called the Senate Bill 158, which is essentially the way it's named in the legislation is the reform legislation to protect the health of vulnerable communities. I just want to mention that because that is the vision of the governor. We want to make sure that SB 158 embodies that vision. Okay. Next slide, please. The Cleanup and Vulnerable Communities Initiative has 6 components to it. That has discovery enforcement program that I am responsible for. And there's an orphan program. It's about $40 million. That's also part of the discovery enforcement program. The other 4 components of it is community benefit agreements, technical assistance grants, workforce development program has about $4 million to really provide an opportunity for people living in those communities to have careers and to have opportunities to have jobs associated with our program. Equitable community and revitalization grant, I think you have probably heard a lot about that. That's about the largest component of the CVCI initiative. It's about $270 million. So that's what the overall components of the Cleanup and Vulnerable Communities Initiative. Our program, Discovery Enforcement Program, is actually going to be focusing on dry cleaning sites. There are about 7,495 dry cleaning sites, active and inactive, that we have in our database that we're going to be focusing on. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the focus is going to be on vulnerable communities characterized by high pollution burden and adverse socioeconomic conditions. There are we are using a CalEnviroscreen mapping tool that is developed by OEHA. It's a numerical number associated with the census tracts, and that takes into consideration 4 major components, 4 major indicators: the pollution burden, population characteristics, environmental effects, and socioeconomic factors. Each of them have sub-indicators. It's about 13 to 14 sub-indicators within those 4 categories that are used to develop a cumulative score on a census tract that we are basically using that. So this is basically developed by OEHA, and we're using that mapping tool to identify those vulnerable communities across the state. Next slide, please. The main focus and objective of our program is to identify the universe of active and inactive dry cleaning sites. We have done that a few years ago. We have been working on it very, very hard. As I mentioned, there are about 7,495 sites that we have identified. Again, we are going to be focusing on vulnerable communities as an initiative. Vision is, and then evaluate risk to public health. If we find that there is going to be immediate risk to public health associated with these sites, then we're going to take immediate response action. And then, of course, subsequent to that, we will take enforcement action on those sites, which means that either the investigation either would be funded by Dtsc or the property owner would potentially fund those investigations as appropriate. And then, of course, clean up subsequent to that. Next slide, please. The program is annual. It's kind of an annual cycle that I'm presenting it to you right now. We every year at this, our fiscal year starts on July 1st. So every year, and even prior to that, we will start. We will start prioritizing sites from the list that we already have. A list of 7,495 sites. This year, we have identified about 112 sites statewide. We will be doing phase 1 assessment first, and then we're going to perform discovery investigation. Based on that data that we collect from those 112 sites, we're going to conduct risk evaluation and then evaluate the need for enforcement on those sites. Based on that step, we'll issue enforcement order, perform time-critical removal action, which I mentioned earlier, response action if needed, execute contract. The department is going to be using its contractors, zone contractors, to do this work. And then subsequent to that, we're going to implement enforcement action, which may include conducting preliminary endangerment assessment, supplemental site investigation, remedial action plan, and the RAW, which is essentially the cleanup the process. Throughout the process, we are fully committed to engage public step on the way, both at the local level, regional level, and the state level. We also have a component in the discovery enforcement program, what we call a petition process. And we're going to talk about it a little bit, that allows the public to really submit site for DTSC to be included or for evaluation, so that we can incorporate public interest in our process. Based on the information on the site, DTSC will evaluate and figure out whether or not that site can be part of our annual site investigation program. So this is essentially, every year, the department is going to go through this whole process. As you can imagine, it's a 4-year kind of a program. It will actually, the workload of the program will increase significantly as we move into this program in future years. Next slide, please. Why focus on dry cleaners? These dry cleaners, next slide, we're going to focus on that because they use chemicals that are potentially carcinogenic. One of the things that I mentioned to you earlier on is that the magnitude is huge. There are about 7,495 active and inactive dry cleaners I mentioned to you. A lot of them are located in proximity to the residential communities, and they have potentially have the impact the health of the residents in the nearby communities out there. So that's the scale of it and the potential to impact. Potential for release, they use what we call perchloroethylene solvent for the operations. And if several studies have indicated that there's a 75% potential that these dry cleaners can cause contamination. So that's really the potential for release, another factor we are considering, and that's why this is very, very important. And then once the PCE is released to the environment, then it can pose a significant threat to public health and the environment. Next slide, please. As I mentioned to you, the dry cleaners are basically located in communities that have pollution burden and that have sensitive population in vulnerable communities, right? So that's one of the other reason why we are focusing on dry cleaners. Community characteristic, these dry cleaners, a lot of these that we have selected have community characteristic with high poverty rates and high unemployment rates and adverse socioeconomic condition. So that's one of the reasons, and both these criteria, pollution burden and community characteristics, are basically taken from calendar screen mapping tools developed by OEM. Next slide, please. I did talk about the prioritization process. So obviously the department does not have the ability to address these sites, all of these 7,495 sites. So there has to be a prioritization process. So I wanted to kind of shed some light on that. The first thing we are trying to do is using calendar screen scores of 75% or more. Apply that screen to 7,495 sites. Most of our sites in Southern California, I'm going to show that map to you a few slides ahead. So about 70%, 2/3 of our sites in Southern California. So that's the reason why, because of the enormity of the sites, we are using higher percentile scores in the South. It's 95% and above. In East, we are using 90 percentile and above. And in the West, and I'm going to show you the map, what these regions means, you'll see it in the map. So in the West, we are using 80th percentile and above. After applying those screens, we still have a very large number of sites. So we figured that we should apply another filter, which is called sensitive receptors, defined as residences close to the property schools, daycare, senior center, and the hospital. We're using a proximal distance of 50 feet. So if you have a dry cleaner within 50 feet and with the 95th percentile score located in the south, that site has a priority. And got sort of make it to the list. And that's what we did. We came up with a manageable list of site, 112 site for first year. At this time, we are finalizing contracts to start executing this work. We anticipate that from 112 sites, there are about probably 65 that go into discovery investigation. It's all projection. Don't hold me to it. I'm just estimating that number. If that number is going to be bigger, then we're going to investigate that number. If it happens to be 80, 85, 90, we're going to have to do discovery investigation, those as well. Okay, did I miss anything on this slide? So the first criteria, CES score, 75% or greater, specifically with the South, 95%, East, 90% and higher, and West, 80% and higher. And then apply the proximal distance to the sensitive receptors of 50 feet. That's how we came up with 112 sites. All right, next slide, please. This is a map of site in the eastern region, western region, and the south. The reason why this map is divided into 3 regions is because we want to make sure that we have equity across the state with respect to coverage, and we are able to investigate site throughout the state rather than just concentrate in the south. So that's the reason that's why you see these map division in western, eastern, and south division. I already mentioned that the percentile scores. So that's what we're using for each region. Next slide, please. So this is a specific map. It's kind of a more magnified map for Western Division sites. There are 18 sites that we have selected. There are 5 counties: Alameda, Contra Costa, Santa Clara, San Francisco, and San Mateo County. Next slide, please. This is the Eastern Division map. Again, this has 18 sites. Represented by 6 counties: Kern, Fresno, Merced, Tulare, San Joaquin, and Sacramento. Next slide. And the South Division, I mentioned you, 2/3 of our sites are in South Division. Mostly, and this year, even though the sites are distributed all over the Southern California region, this year we are selecting 16 sites, and Los Angeles and San Bernardino is represented in that list. Next slide, please. Where we are on it, what's the progress? Finalizing contract for discovery investigation. As I mentioned earlier, we are pretty close to starting a discovery investigation for year 1 sites. And also we are planning for the next year, which means that site prioritization process is going to be starting pretty soon here. We're planning to incorporate Calvin Virus Screen Scores 4.0. We used 3.0 for 2021 and 22 prioritization process. While we were doing the prioritization process, Calvin Virus Screen 4.0 was not available at the time. Calvin Virus Screen Score 4.0 only recently have become available, so we plan to incorporate that in our prioritization process for next year. And we're also evaluating other factors that might be useful for us. Could identify vulnerable communities that are disproportionately affected. We're looking at that right now. We're not there yet. We hopefully we'll be able to identify a few factors that can help us prioritize the site even further. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what the department concern again was, to make sure that somehow or the other we are able to have intentional engagement with the public. Which is we propose a petition process to our management. They loved it. That's why this process is developed for you guys, for the public, to select site, submit sites to us for evaluation purposes. This is an online process, a very, very simple form. You just have to fill out few items on the application. The department will evaluate that. The messaging, the reason why we wanted to do that is allow us to directly engage with the public and allows the public to communicate to us the sites that you may have concern about and give us the opportunity to evaluate them. Allows DTSC to track the public interest as well. We want to make sure that we will track it appropriately so we know where geographically the public interest is the most, and also what kind of concerns public is raising. So that really helps us a lot and can inform the future site selection. Based on the information we get from you, we will have that opportunity to look at future site prioritization process and see if there are any of those concerns that you have raised we have an opportunity to incorporate in our process. So just essentially go to our website. We'll send you some links here that will allow you to use our petition process, links to the petition process on our webpage. It's very simple. It's just a simple form. Next slide, please. The criteria for our evaluation during a petition process is going to be the same: Calorie Screen Scores at or above 75%, and the proximity to sensitive receptor. That's what primarily the criteria we're going to be using. Typically, and assuming that we have 10 petitions submitted quarterly, we should be able to turn those petitions around between 90 to 120 days. So and we'll monitor those petitions to make sure that we comply with all these deadlines for you, and we respond to the public in a timely manner. Let's just say if you accept this, you propose a site and the department evaluates it, and based on our determination, the site should be included, we'll make a recommendation to the management. If the site is included in our list, let's just say we have 112 sites, we have to drop off one site. We have to evaluate whether we need to drop off one of our sites that we have selected through our prioritization process. So we'll evaluate that. If you propose a site that we think can be included in that year, that particular site coming through the petition process will replace the one. So it's kind of like a zero-sum game. So we'll evaluate that, and we will provide you with the input on that process. Next slide, please. The other, a rather smaller component of this discovery enforcement program is our orphan sites. The orphan sites, there are about 21 sites. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail. These sites are called orphan because they don't have responsible parties identified on the property, and or the property owners are not viable to really take care of the investigation and cleanup that is required on these sites. So that's why these called orphan site. Traditionally, the department has been using its limited funding to address these sites. Department management has made a commitment, strong commitment, to fund these sites with a CVCI program, and they allocated $40 million. That shows that and a lot of these sites are located in the vulnerable communities as well. So the management has shown strong commitment to allocate funding to this site. Traditionally, we did not have enough funds. Sometimes did not have enough fund to investigate and clean up these sites. But right now, the Discovery Enforcement Program will take on that task and make sure that those funds are available to those 21 orphan sites. Next slide, please. Yeah, so their orphan sites are selected based on a few important criteria. They are known releases that already have a lot of data on the sites, right? There are 21 of them, as I indicated to you. On the right-hand panel, you see the location of these sites. There are 21 of them. They are located throughout the state. As I mentioned earlier, there's no responsible party identified that could provide funding for investigation and cleanup. And as I mentioned earlier as well, $40 million has been allocated. Depending on the needs of these sites, it's not going to be equally distributed. Depending on the needs of the site, the fund will become available for them and which stage they're in right at the time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I think that should be it. I'm happy to, I think we'll take some question and answer, Jerry. And I absolutely thank you so much for joining us today. I hope my presentation was very helpful to you. And I think I'm going to give it over to Jerry. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you so much, Rafat. I always enjoy your presentations. Thank you. So we're now at the Q&A part of this event. There are 3 ways that you can ask a question. You can raise your hand using the raise hand feature that's in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question into the Q&A. Or if you're calling in on your phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand, and then we'll take your question. I do see one question in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee. Where can I find a list of the sites for the Bay Area? Well, that's a good question. Rafat, go ahead.
Yeah, so the list, we have a live map that's available to you on our website, and the list is also available as well. So there's an interactive map on our website. So if you go to the area of interest, I think your area of interest is Bay Area, you can actually look at the map. There are dots on the map, and if you click on that map, it'll give you the information on those sites. That's live and it's interactive.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Another question from anonymous attendee, is PCE banned?
PCE, let me look at the question. So PCE is going to be phased out. I think it's 2024. Last time I checked regulation, don't hold me to it. I checked it a few years ago. PCE is not regulated, as dry cleaner is not regulated. It's regulated by Air Resources Board, and that's going to be phased out in 2024. Last time I checked.
All right. Thank you so much, Rafat. There's a question on here from Amr. Can you post the links again? So I think that we'll ask that the link for the Discovery and Enforcement webpage be put into the chat. We are going to post it again after this slide, but if you want to look at it now, we'll go ahead and put it into the chat for you right now. On that webpage, there's a variety of other resources on there for you too. Thank you so much. Anonymous attendee asks, can you define what you mean by contracts are in the process of being finalized?
Well, thank you for that question. Contract means contract, which means that the work that needs to be done, we have the zone contractor for every office, every region. And before we do anything, before we start the work, we have to have a contract with our contractors, with our zone contractors, which defines the scope of work and the cost associated with the scope of work. So we developed that already. That's being negotiated with our contractors right now. Great.
Thank you so much for
answer that question.
Right now, we'll go ahead and take a question. Actually, let me check and see. We have an interpreter today, Brittany Cardenas. I'll ask her if we have any questions on the Spanish audio. No questions? Thank you so much, Brittany. We'll go to raise hands, Ms. LaDonna Williams. Please go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Yes, good morning, LaDonna Williams, all positives possible. I actually have a couple of questions. One is, I noticed on the present, it did say that we could go to the site, I guess, and recommend sites. However, as in Solano County, I noticed Solano County was not one of the counties or Vallejo listed, particularly South Vallejo and East Vallejo, with large populations of disadvantaged, underserved populations. They are not on your list. However, we engaged with Dtsc pre-COVID back in, I believe it was 2017, 2018, maybe, very issue that included these sites that were listed on the map. So I was just wondering how it is that you went about choosing these sites and communities when you list that your focus was the most vulnerable, most disadvantaged, when Vallejo has some of the worst environmental exposures and health burdens. This community has been left out. So why is it the burden put on community? Why are the burdens put on communities to tell you what communities should be on there when you already have this historic data that's been previously collected that confirms that there are vapor intrusion from these cleaners? In addition, and I'm glad you guys are using 3.0 as opposed to 4.0, because some of our communities, our most vulnerable communities, have been redefined that does not list their exposure burdens accurately, in our opinion, when we have been exposed to these dry cleaners. And there are dry cleaners themselves that were historically listed and still pose current health burdens that are not being considered or are even showing up on your map. And we did previously send notification to Dtsc about this issue. My other question is, when you talk about finalizing these contracts with, and I wasn't clear if you were saying zone contractors. I couldn't understand what you were saying because there was some feedback in your background. But who are considered these contractors with Dtsc? Is that including impacted and affected communities at this point? And then also, is PFAS or PFAS part of the chemical compound, since that's the trending chemicals as well that are being evaluated? Are they being included in these processes that are far reaching in our drinking water and the vapor intrusion that is coming and backing up into the homes as a result of these exposures from the dry cleaners?
Thank you so much for your questions, LaDonna. I know that there are more than one, so we'll start with the last one.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, let me clarify, make sure I understand. LaDonna. Hi, LaDonna, how are you? Good to talk to you again. I trying to understand, is there a question about the zone contractors, Dtsc? I was trying to write it at the same time and trying to understand the question. Could you repeat that, LaDonna, the second question, please?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the zone contractors, right? I couldn't understand if that's what you were saying was zone, ZONE.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I wanted to get some clarification on who are considered these zone contractors.
So the department every 2 to 3 years has to go through a list of the contractor on the list of solicitation for the contractors to be put on our Dtsc list. Okay, there's very rigorous internal criteria to select them. The reason why you need to have contractors on a zone contractor list for each office is give us the ability to use state fund. If there's a need for it, we should be able to immediately respond to a complaint or an investigation that needs to be done right away. Excite is one example of that. We're not using zone contractor, we're using our own contractors to really do the work. There are the 21 sites that I'm talking about, LaDonna, that work all is done by zone contractor. These sites have documented exposure. So that give us the ability to use state funds to investigate these sites and remediate these sites.
Right. What is a zone contractor, though? I guess that's what I'm asking.
So the zone contractors are all the remediation contractors are evaluated by the department, internally by the department, and whoever qualifies and meets department's contracting criteria and contracting laws of the state are actually evaluated based on the criteria and then put on the list. Put on the list for each office. There is 3 contractors typically that we have on our list for the zone for each office. Each office has a certain zone that they cover, right? For example, like a Berkeley office has 3 zone contractors that will cover Northern California all the way from the Oregon border all the way down to all the Bay Area and some of the Central Valley. Okay. Sacramento office has a lot of Sacramento area and all the way down to Fresno and Visalia offices.
So are these zone contractors, do they include community-based organizations?
They are just environmental contractors. I'm not sure I understand, LaDonna, the community-based, what does that mean? Does that mean that
a community-based organization, groups of residents and or impacted community members who are working on environmental justice, environmental health, exposure pathways impacting their quality of life in their communities?
So they are expert. They are considered to be the expert who have done this all their life. That they have engineers and scientists who are trained to do investigation and remediation work.
Oh, okay. So these are pretty much the professional engineers and folks that do the digging and remediation. That's what you mean by zone contractors? Oh, okay.
And you had question number one, I think you asked about communities that have that are impacted, right? And the department is not able to get to them. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, these are particularly East Vallejo that has a number of, I believe it was 4 dry cleaners that dated back in the 1960s up to present that are and have been documented as impacting the community. And there has been confirmed vapor intrusions, and they destroyed a well. The cleaners that was just roughly 20 feet away from some homes and trailer parks, they're not listed on your list. However, the remediation and the destruction of the well is on there, is documented, yet it's not listed on your list of concerned sites, although the pollution has been left behind and still impacting the community is still present. But these sites did not manage, and that's just one of the 4 that is in this small area community, but they're not listed on your sites of communities or areas to be included in this, I guess, this funding or this project.
So let me ask you a question. Are you talking, when you talk about the list, are you talking about the list of 112 sites, or are you talking about 7,495 sites?
Okay, well, it's probably both.
Okay.
It is both. It's not listed on either or, from my understanding. But there was documentation on GeoTracker that then connected with you guys that shows the previous remedial action that took place, and I guess supposed cleanup efforts, but they really weren't cleanup efforts, but they're not listed. And we were able to map them out.
So if it's not included in 112, I have to look into it, but let me address this because I think it's an important question. 112 site, if it's not listed on 112 site, it means that it did not meet the CES criteria, and it's probably not within 50 feet of proximal distance of the sensitive receptor, and or LaDonna, the sites that have been traditionally or are currently being overseen by our sister agency or even DTSC, that site is not going to be on the list because we know that site's been worked on by other sister agency and or the department. So that site is not going to be addressed. We're not going to include that site because we know that site is already under DTSC and or regional boards oversight, and or sometimes, a lot of times this happens a lot, LaDonna, that local agencies overseeing that cleanup or investigation. So we feel that that's just not the good use of resources that other agencies are already working on.
So were there measures at least put in place to where you're not bouncing community between the two agencies, between DTSC, who then points the finger at the water boards, who then point the fingers back at DTSC? That's also another issue as well. And the community is caught in between. But the major issue is there's a problem with the community being impacted by former and current dry cleaners, and the community is being overlooked. And our fear is that Cal EnviroScreen, with this remapping and even the previous mapping, was inadequate to adequately characterize the serious burdens and exposures to the community.
I really hear your concern. Yeah.
Thank you so much, LaDonna. I'm hoping that does answer all of your questions. Did you have an outstanding question?
No, but if I do, I can get back in queue so someone else can answer their or get their questions addressed.
All right. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the time that you take to be with us. Thank you. Next on the hand raise is Mr. Frank Koch. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. You are unmuted. I think we can hear you. Go ahead. Okay, we'll come back to you. Going back to the Q&A box, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. I did mark it answered on accident, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it again. So for year one, do we already have all the contractors in place for all the projects that you plan to undertake?
The answer is yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much. Next question in the queue is what remediation for a listed site would remediation for a listed site still be able to proceed through DTSC's voluntary cleanup program?
Would remediation for a listed site still be available?
Of the 112, would they still be able to do voluntary cleanup?
I'm not quite sure what I understand the question, Jerry. I apologize. Would remediation for a listed site, which means 112 listed sites be able to proceed through DTSC's? I'm having a hard time understanding. And
maybe we can ask the attendee to type in a little bit more clarification.
Yes, yeah.
And then we'll try to get the microphone open for Mr. Frank Koch. Go ahead.
Yeah. I don't want to answer the question, when I really want to make sure I understand it.
All right, I'm going to ask to unmute again for Mr. Frank. You should see a little pop-up that says, please unmute. Maybe he stepped away. We'll go ahead and go with Alec Dotzer. Please go ahead and ask your question. Okay, I think we're having a little bit of an audio issue. Let me try to. Okay, I see your microphone, so you just have to press unmute. And the mute button is on your toolbar on the bottom left.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering a little bit more about these zone contractors. Is there a process to become a zone contractor and work on these? Has that already been decided for this year? Are you looking for more professionals to help with the cleanup of these properties?
Thank you, Alec, for the question. I think the question is, zone contracts are going to be used for 112 site. The answer is yes. That process, DTSC will have a rolling process every 2 to 3 years and will generate a new list of zone contractors. Hopefully that answers your question, Alec.
Thank you. Back to our Q&A box. Can you discuss what enforcement actions will look like at dry cleaner sites? For instance, will these sites likely have financially responsible parties that can be compelled to complete investigation and cleanup work?
Well, that's a great question. The enforcement action associated with the dry cleaning site would be a traditional enforcement action that the department will take. Since it's a new program, we are developing steps that we need to take to execute our enforcement action. We're working with Office of Legal Counsel. That process is being developed. Enforcement action for the dry cleaner, a typical dry cleaner would basically constitute informing the dry cleaner, operator of the business, that we have data to suggest there's a release on your property. We require you to investigate these sites and blah, blah, and then, clean it up if necessary. And here is the order that the department has for you to sign. Will commit you to do the investigation and cleanup. At the same time, the department will use what we call the ability to pay analysis and see the viability of the property owner and the business operation. If they are viable, the department will take enforcement action. We'll make sure to give them deadlines to comply with, and hopefully some penalties associated with it.
Thank you, Rafat. We don't see any hands in the raised hands, so we'll ask the interpreter if we have any questions in the Spanish audio. Thank you so much. So there is a question here about, does the water board have a similar source of funding from the state to address sites where they are the lead?
I am not the one to answer that question, but water board, I understand, and I've worked with the SCAPS program. I understand they have quite a bit of money for the dry cleaners under SCAPS program. I heard that funding has increased in recent years, but I do not know if they have similar source of funding from the governor. I do not know the answer to that question.
Probably have to check with them.
Thank
you. So is there a cap on the grant amount for each site?
So let me clarify something. This is not a grant. So we have a ECRG program that is a grant program. Our program is just funding investigation, accelerating investigation, cleanup on these, revitalizing these communities. So when we talk about grant, we talk about money being designated to use the fund to investigate and clean up these sites. They're not too much repercussion. In our discovery enforcement program, as the name suggests, the department will use its funding and will try to recover their cost from the viable property owners. So,
all right. Thank you so much. So for that question that we were unclear about before, about would remediation for a listed site still be available to proceed through DTSC's voluntary cleanup program, we did get clarification that Discovery and Enforcement plans to issue imposed orders or consent orders rather than allowing voluntary agreements. So I'm putting that in the Q&A for you to view. And we have some time. We know this is just a lunchtime event with limited time, but we've gotten through all the raised hands and the questions. If there's other questions that you need answered about maybe CVCI in general or other parts of CVCI, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I can try to answer those for you. I see Ms. LaDonna. I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute and ask your question. Thank you.
Yes, I was just wondering, is this program similar to the ECRG? And I apologize if I got the acronyms wrong. That's where it asks the property owners to contract or sign agreements if their properties are impacted by any of these cleaners. Because what we noticed through that ECRG project or program is property owners were required to sign contracts and agreements of cleanup or remediation and being asked to take on this cost. Yet they're not funded. When they apply for funding, their funding is being denied. Is it a similar process through what you guys are doing? And you said it's not a grant. So clearly money has to be paid out to somebody and somewhere, but is the property owner taking on this responsibility?
That's a great question, LaDonna. So there are two different programs. LaDonna, ECRG is basically a grant program. So department set aside that money to give to the applicants who applied, approved applicant who applied for that grant to do the investigation, cleanup, right? Our program is not like that. Our program has $152 million allocated to us to conduct the investigation, discovery investigation first. So department is committing resources to do discovery investigation. And then subsequent to that, when the department takes enforcement action, the department will have two options. Department will have an opportunity to use the resource fund under certain conditions. And the second option is the department will actually compel through enforcement process to the property owner to do the investigation. So it will be a property owner-led investigation under DTSC oversight. Which department will provide oversight? In which case, the property owner will have to pay for a department oversight, and of course, they'll hire the contractor to do the investigation and cleanup, as opposed to the first option I mentioned, enforcement order, issue an enforcement order. The property owner is not viable. The department will actually use its own fund to investigate and clean up their site. Hopefully that answers your question, Madonna.
Not really, because it almost sounds like you're saying the same thing. It's just your department is doing it with a different name, and I guess DTSC's other department under the supposed revitalization program is doing another. So they are the grants, but you guys are not grants. But the work still, one way or another, has to be done through this investigation and remediation project. And so if we're talking about, it's just really confusing, because if you're talking about addressing vulnerable communities and disadvantage, and especially with those high health burdens, it can be assumed that property owners in those areas have the financial stability, but they may be hanging on a thread as well, since they are the ones that are financing or under the low income subsidy programs or what have you. They're being asked to take on this burden and this cost of cleanup that the state has allowed to occur through business dealings. So how is that fair to the property owners to pick up this burden? Should not the agency or you guys, through these funding pools, because I looked at the chart of funding that was available, and that's another issue. It looks like community benefits is $800,000 compared to the millions that are put into the other. It just doesn't seem to me that your focus of supporting and building affected and impacted disadvantaged communities, that goal is going to be achieved to benefit those that are already overburdened. It seems to me that the fees and the funding is going to the professionals once again, and the agencies paying them for their processes. It doesn't answer my question. It just adds more questions and more concerns that there's this title of supporting disadvantaged and underserved communities, yet your process is creating an even bigger environmental injustice and burden by the way it's set up. And it's confusing, very confusing. From what you described, it sounds like the same issues being played out under cleanup investigation and cost and responsibility, but it's just a different name being put on it under EGR or ERCG or the grant process.
So I would say that ECRG process, I'm not the one to talk to. I am generically familiar with LaDonna. I won't claim knowledge on what criteria they're using for the grant. I understand that there's a very detailed criteria for applicants to meet.
I'm familiar with it. I did go through the process, which is why I'm looking at what you guys are doing as well.
Yeah, well, the comment seems to be very, very insightful, LaDonna. Unfortunately, I can't answer it because I'm not familiar with the ECRG program.
Okay, I appreciate your honesty with that.
Yeah.
Thank you, LaDonna. There are no other hands raised. I just want to check one more time with the interpreter to make sure we don't have any questions on the Spanish audio. No questions. Okay, thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you everyone for your patience. We are going
to Jerry, a couple of things I might want to add to the
Sure, go ahead.
LaDonna's question. I'll try to attempt. So LaDonna, the ECRG funds are actually designed for cities, local agencies, and nonprofits to use those funds to really promote, revitalize, investigate, and clean up those sites and revitalize those communities. That's what I know. That's what I've been told. I think that's what they're designed to do. So they have a very different perspective as opposed to discovery enforcement program. Our job is to go find these sites, investigate these sites, and hold polluters responsible. So it's a very different vision. Okay.
Thank you, Rafat.
Mm-hmm.
We'll go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Seeing no other questions. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. One more question. I think it's a follow-up to the voluntary cleanup question. Mm-hmm. So that the dry cleaner owner would have to pay back DTSC, but I think you covered that a little bit with your conversation with Madonna. Thank you. All right. So I just want to make sure I didn't skip it. Thank you, anonymous attendee, whoever you are, for the questions. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for all of your questions and your comments. We do enjoy having this robust conversation with you all. It definitely helps. We've covered a lot during our conversation, and we encourage everyone to visit the DTSC Discovery and Enforcement webpage that we'll be putting in the chat again for everyone. That page has the list of the 112 sites for year one. It has the list of the orphan sites and the link to the petition application webpage. To receive updates on our program, you can subscribe to the e-list, which is located online at www.dtsc.ca/DTSC-E-lists. And once you get there, you'll scroll down to Discovery and Enforcement and click subscribe. You can also go to the EnviroStore web link to view information and documents on the D&E program, and we'll put all of that stuff in the chat for you. Next slide, please. And that's all we have. Thank you so much for spending your lunchtime with us today. If you have the chat open, it's my understanding you can copy and paste it to a Word document. So as we say farewell, I'll leave the meeting open for a couple of moments just to let people copy the chat if you need to. Otherwise, you can email us and we'll get the information to you. Thank you so much.